In this video, we are going to do the walkthrough of the various design patterns that you can adopt for the DNS configuration that require communications with private endpoints. This is the Microsoft Learn page where there are multiple design patterns outlined by the Microsoft when you need to interact with the private endpoints resources. Okay, so let's go through one by one so that you have a solid understanding. I'm not going to get into the actual demo in this case. It's just because of it requires a little bigger setup, and also there are multiple design patterns. So rather than going through the demo, it's better to understand various design patterns that you can adopt based on your use case. Okay. So what are the design patterns? There are 5 design patterns that are basically outlined on this particular Learn page. You can go ahead and take a look very closely so that you know exactly what are the things that you need to consider in each case. Now, the first one is virtual network workloads without Azure Private Resolver, right? See, currently, whatever the kind of design pattern that Microsoft covered, it has a very high emphasis on Azure Private Resolver. Previously, whatever the design pattern that Microsoft provided for the public was using the custom DNS server which is hosted in the Azure itself. Now that is not there, so you might see this difference. And if you working in any organization where the DNS forwarder is sitting there in the Azure, then it's a time for you to replace that with Azure Private Resolver. Okay, so all this design pattern is basically considering the Azure Private Resolver, not the VM sitting within the Azure cloud. So that is one of the difference. And we will only use Azure Private Resolver in our discussion because that is a go-to pattern now. So first design pattern is basically virtual network workloads without a Azure Private Resolver. In this particular case, you can see that there is a virtual network. Within that virtual network, there is a private endpoint for the database, and there is a client VM hosted in the subnet. Now, this virtual network is using Azure provided DNS. Okay, so when this virtual machine want to talk to this particular database which has a private endpoint, then it basically talk to the Azure DNS, and Azure DNS talk to the private link.database.windows.net private DNS zone. Okay, now if you're not understanding this one, don't worry. We will do the demo on these particular things in the next video. All good. But private DNS zone for the private link, right? There is a list provided by Microsoft for the services which support private endpoint. So this Azure provided DNS is talking to the private DNS, and that private DNS has a virtual network link to the private network. Okay, and that is how the client VM basically can talk to the private endpoint and get the private endpoint IP. All right, so this is using Azure provided DNS. Okay, and without Azure Private Resolver, because everything is in the cloud itself. Right, now let's see the second pattern. Paired virtual network workloads without Azure Private Resolver. So again, in this case as well, you got a private endpoint sitting in the hub, and there are 2 spoke network. You can see left side and right hand side. Right, and this particular spoke networks are paired with hub, and there is only one DNS zone called private link.database.windows.net, and both the networks has a virtual network link on both the side. That is what you can see, right? And when these particular clients want to interact with the private endpoint, they also go through the Azure provided DNS and then access this private DNS zone. Now, Another thing is that Azure Private Resolver for on-premises workload. Now this particular VM is sitting on premise and connected to the virtual network over express route, and this particular client VM is trying to access this particular private endpoint. So how that is possible? Now this particular VM is utilizing Azure DNS Private Resolver. Okay, so Azure Private DNS Resolver, again going to the Azure provided DNS and then basically accessing the resource through that virtual private link. That is another pattern. Let's see this pattern: Azure Private Resolver with on-premise DNS forwarder. Now this is a pattern most of the time you will see in most of the setup, because there is a need from on-premise to interact with the resources that support the private endpoint, and there is on-premise infrastructure already, there is a DNS setup. So this particular thing that you can see that it's internal DNS to the client VM, it's on-premise virtual network, it has a conditional forwarder setup to what? database.windows.net, right? And where that conditional forwarder is basically pointing, that is the IP address of private resolver. The private resolver is a managed service sitting in the Azure itself, and this particular conditional forwarder is basically pointing to that private resolver. Now this can be anything like a blob storage or key vault, anything, right? And that is how this particular name resolution works with this kind of consideration, right? Another one is Azure Private Resolver for virtual network and on-premises workload. Similar thing, but in this case you got a the client sitting in the cloud as well. It's almost like a similar setup, but in this particular case again you interacting with the private resolver from the on-premise and from the cloud as well. And in this case you are using Azure provided DNS. So in this setup, if you look at you are using like a Azure provided DNS, right, for your name resolution for the private endpoint. So those are the 5 popular like a design pattern that you need to understand. You might need to give a try as well so that exactly how it works, but almost like all these design patterns are used, based on your configuration and setup. You might end up using these design patterns in the cloud. So that's all about the walkthrough.